Okay, the comment section is already going. Why don't you just buy a mountain bike? That thing's ugly. It's too expensive. Well, everybody knows you don't go full mountain.
You're serious? You don't know. Everybody knows you never go full retard.
Well, all joking aside, welcome to this James the Bike Guy, where in front of us today we've got the 2023 Specialized Diverge STR. And while this bike has some real polarizing looks and does make you question why you need a full suspension gravel bike, we're going to get into those features and talk a bit more about this bike because it is truly unique in the world of gravel bikes on sale today. So diving into this unique looking steed, the 2023 Specialized Diverge STR comes after a lineage of some great gravel bikes from Specialized. And in fact, Specialized was one of the first major manufacturers to make a production gravel bike, not a bike that was just converted from one of their cyclocross rigs. And while there were a lot of other brands before them, Specialized was one of the first to bring it to mass market. And that first generation Specialized Diverge really shook up the market, got people riding gravel instead of endurance bikes, and opening up the possibilities of taking your road bike on some dirt instead of just stuck to some pavement. And fast forward to today, there's now been several generations of the Diverge. I believe this is now the fourth generation of the Diverge, and in fact, it now offers both rear suspension as well as front suspension, which does beg the question, at what point does it just become a mountain bike? Well, this particular rig has some really cool upgrades for 2023, and I just want to get into the frame and talk a bit about it, as well as we'll see a bit about the part spec on it. But first off, elephant in the room, what is this thing going on to the back? Well, this is what Specialized is calling their rear future shock. So Specialized has been known for having this front future shock, which is on the bike. This offers 20 millimeters of front suspension. It's of course adjustable via this hydraulic damper, so you can make it more firm or more supple. And that allowed the front end of the bike to become much more compliant. And on the prior generations, they ran a drop stay in the back where the chain stays were a bit lower than the seat tube and top tube connection. And that gave some compliance to the rear end. But as like everything, when people start gravel riding, they start getting more aggressive on the terrain they might go through. And especially in a place like New England where I live, you have a lot of gravel roads which are more or less XC mountain bike trails. And that is where this rear future shock comes in. So back here, you've got a seat tube that's going into the bike, and then you've got what they call their tendon, which is this aluminum strut to go forward to a 30 millimeter suspension setup. So inside of this is a hydraulic damper inside the frame that is controlling that tendon going to that seat tube, allowing rearward flex of 30 millimeters. And you do have a control to be able to dampen or lighten the amount of resistance on that damper to smooth out the ride based on your riding style, but then a ton of complication as far as getting it set up. And I say complication just because it takes quite a bit of work to get this guy going. But once you're set up, from the people I've talked to who have had some real time on these, it is pretty incredible. So when I talk about complication, the seat tube, this piece that goes into the bike that the seat post is going into, well, each one of these Diverge STRs is going to come with two of those, and they can be rotated 90 degrees for different compliance setups. Along with, in total, there's 18 different combinations because there's 9 different tubes you can get for the rear end, 2 different positions for them, 18 in total. And that's going to give a huge range as far as suspension tuning is concerned. That means in the back end of this bike, you're going to get rear suspension, and the bike's rear end is actually going to stay solid. So the wheel's not moving, the compliance is happening for your body. So that matches the compliance up with the back with what you have happening in the front. So you've got 20 millimeters of front suspension effectively and 30 millimeters of rear suspension to make this bike be pretty capable for a wide range of trails. Now, of course, Because it's going to be asking and wanting some chunkier, rougher terrain, Specialized has driven in with wider tire clearance, and previous generation ran up to 42 millimeter tires, whereas this bike is coming stock with 42 millimeter tires, these Tracer Pros on 700C wheels. So the new generation, this STR, can fit up to 47 millimeter tires on a 700C wheel, or 650B by 2.1. So pretty massive tire clearance. And 2.1s, again, is that really just a mountain bike? And I think that's kind of the thought process behind here, is at what point are you not just putting dropper bars on a road bike? Well, most of that does come into the geometry, because this is going to be fitting more like an endurance bike in a similar geometry setup as the prior generation. Although keep in mind, because that seat tube is going to be moving a little bit as you ride, that will change your reach of this bike, as well as your position of your knee over the pedal spindle based on where you're bouncing around. But the bike does offer some great ability to attach racks to the front end. It does have the capability for a top bento box, and along with 2 water bottle cages inside the frame and one just in front of the bottom bracket, you'll also see we've got a swap box. And what a swap box is this cover, which you put your water bottle cage onto, then opens up, allowing you to get into here, where you now have this swap bag to put your tube and all your gear that you might need out on a ride inside. But while we have this open, let's take a look at that carbon construction. It is pretty nice and clean inside of there. I love that you can see the carbon, and you might notice this kind of bump out that's happening there. And that's because your shift and hydraulic cables that would run through the bike, although this is a wireless shifting in rear, it is still a hydraulic disc brake bike. Specialized is running tubes inside, so you can actually just send the cables through without having to worry about fishing them or finding them inside of the frame. It's a pretty neat little function that Specialized has added. Should make it a lot easier to service the bike. And once you're done with the bag inside, you can take the little water bottle cage cover, slide that in, clip it in place, and now your frame is cleared back up. One thing that's conspicuously missing on the Diverge STR is, of course, going to be rear mounts. It does have a spot to be able to add a fender setup to this bike, but there are no mounts for a rear bag setup. So one thing to consider when you're setting up those 18 different combinations for the seat tube and seat post setup, if you're going to be running some weight on the seat post going back in one of those bags, you'll need to account for that as well. So that's a look at this new Diverge STR, which is pretty crazy. But let's talk about the part spec. So it's of no surprise that something like this from Specialized with some new tech and new design is gonna be expensive. And this version, being the expert level, comes with some pretty nice spec parts, but it does come in at a healthy $7,500. And that number is at least in February of 2023. And for that, you're going to start off with a SRAM Rival and GX setup. So here we've got the Rival Axis setup. That means this is wireless shifting, hydraulic brakes. So harder gear on this button, easier gear on the other. But you'll see as we go down to the drivetrain, it's a 1x setup. So this is a 1x Rival crankset with a threaded bottom bracket, and it goes out back to the SRAM GX Axis wireless shifting rear derailleur. That is a mountain bike rear derailleur. It shifts through a 11 to 50 tooth rear cassette. This is one of those places that, especially on a $7,500 bike, I would have loved to see that this back end had an XD driver, which would allow the 10 to 50 tooth cassette for the full 500% range, but you still have quite a bit of gear range on the bike. And then, as we were talking about before, the Tracer 42 millimeter tires are mounted up on some Roval Terra wheels. These offer some DT 370 hubs. The Terra wheel set is a carbon 25 millimeter wide carbon rim. And so this Terra C setup with those 370 hubs is a pretty robust wheel setup for this bike. And you then have the power saddle. This is the hollow titanium version. So you've got titanium rails on a carbon fiber seat post. And up front, you've got Specialized Adventure Gear hover bar. So this has a little bit of rise to the bar as you see it comes across, and then you're going to have a nice flare to the handlebar setup, so when you're down in the drops, you're still going to be very comfortable. Well, anyways, now that we've taken a look at the features and designs of this bike, it is time to see what all this tech comes in weighs. And the actual weight of the Diverge STR is going to come in and weigh 21.94 pounds.